when the current federal government began power, we have seen a series of sort of progressively more destructive positions from them. They presented a series of plans and have had absolutely no follow through in terms of implementing them. The past year has been especially notable. We saw Canada becoming a signatory to the Copenhagen Accord and then leaving and being the only country to actually lower its targets out of the Copenhagen Accord. So going from -20 to -17, and then coming up with this line, oh, we're just going to wait for the US to do something. And in that time frame, we've seen the EPA and the US start to introduce policies, and Canada say, oh, no, we're not going to go with that. So it seems like a sort of harmonization of convenience. So whenever it works for us, we'll do it, but probably not. And then, of course, a few months ago, or less than a month ago, I guess, we saw the unelected Senate defeat Bill C-311, the Climate Change Accountability Act, without debate, without consulting on this bill, and that's unprecedented. I mean, there's arguments that something similar happened 70 years ago, but either way, it's, this government is not representing Canadians. It's a minority government. 2/3 of Canadians live in provinces that have more ambitious climate change policies than the federal government. We have leadership on so many other levels, and this government is, just choosing not to represent Canadians who want to see strong action on climate change. Recently, we've reappointed John Baird as the interim Minister of the Environment, and he has historically been a really controversial figure on this particular portfolio. He was in Bali and he, blocked negotiations up until the very last minute. He's been sort of the man behind announcing 2 federal climate change plans that haven't seen the light of day ever, even in addition to the fact that they weren't ambitious enough to start with. So we're also quite concerned with sort of putting someone back on the file that, didn't really care about it to begin with.
So could you explain what Canada did abolishing the bill in 2 sentences really quickly and not use C3 sort of
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry, remind me if I'm using too many acronyms.
No problem.
The Climate Change Accountability Act was the only piece of federal legislation moving through Canadian Parliament. It was voted on numerous times by our elected representatives, so the House of Commons, and passed. So a process point, after it's passed through our elected representatives, it goes to the Senate for final passing. And the Senate is supposed to be, the final sober thought on things. And they usually take the bill, debate it, talk about it, and pass it, because that's their responsibility. They're not the elected body. In this case, they chose to kill it, not only just kill it, but they killed it without even talking about it. So they postponed and postponed and postponed, and then in sort of a snap vote one night, they voted against it when a lot of the other parties weren't represented in the Senate, and the bill effectively dies.
It seems sort of criminal, almost. You shouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah, you would think so, and there's been a lot of people sort of digging into, like I said, the precedents and the legality of this, and of course they can. Legally, it's within their capacity, but it hasn't happened since the 20s. So it's clearly something, that's not generally accepted, and it's a little bit hypocritical, because one of Prime Minister Harper's main campaign notes was, reforming the Senate, changing this unelected body to have less power because they're not representing Canadians.
Now, what would be the motives for the Canadian government behind these kinds of actions?
Well, we have a government right now that, as far as we can see, is working hard on climate change policy by attempting to protect and shelter the Alberta tar sands from having any legislation that will inhibit their growth. So the Canadian government currently gives over $1 billion in tax breaks per year to the fossil fuel industry, particularly in the tar sands. It's ridiculous. We're giving over $1 billion in tax breaks to rich companies that are doing bad things. It's completely unacceptable. This government, we've also seen, is undertaking a concerted and systematic effort to kill progressive climate change policies in other countries and other jurisdictions. They're trying to undermine clean fuel legislation in the European Union, as well as in California and at a federal level in the United States. And they are one of the only countries that is intervening outside of that region in these policies. And it's all in an effort to protect big oil and the expansion of the dirtiest oil on the planet, which of course is the Alberta tar sands.
Now, at a conference like this, how does Canada play their cards?
This is an ongoing challenge for us because, as I said, to negotiate, you have to have something to negotiate with. And this government has next to nothing they're bringing next to nothing to the table to negotiate with. So we're fighting in a way. Canada is becoming progressively irrelevant because people are automatically assuming that they're not going to play a constructive role, and therefore their countries are progressively thinking, let's just ignore Canada while they're here. We've won, the Fossil of the Year award 3 years in a row. We've won the Fossil of the Year award 3 years running now. So that's an award that's given and voted on by over 500 international non-governmental organizations. And it's given to the country that does the most to...
You can just pick up where you left off.
Okay. It's given to the country that does the most to undermine or promote destructive climate change policy at these negotiations. So the community's been pretty generous with us, allowing us to continue to put Canada in this spotlight and call them out for what they're not doing. But it's hard to say how long we're going to be able to continue doing that because progressively this government is playing a more and more relevant role on the international stage.
Yeah.
One more time about the Fossil Award and the 500 plus NGOs that vote on it.
Sure. Yeah. So Canada, the Canadian government has won the Fossil of the Year award 3 years in a row. This is an award that's voted on by over 500 international non-governmental organizations, and it's given to the country that over the span of the 2 weeks of negotiating has done the most to undermine or promote destructive climate change policy throughout the duration of the meetings.
Now, this makes me a little embarrassed to be Canadian.
Join the club.
Like, I traditionally thought, until I got immersed in this, I thought Canada was a great environmental country. That was the impression I had as a Canadian, and I feel like the rest of the world had. What happened?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, we saw when Canada hosted the United Nations climate talks in Montreal, we were credited with playing a really important constructive role in bringing those talks together and helping the first stage of implementation of the Kyoto Protocol. We were looked at as being one of the leaders on this issue.
How was that? Yeah. Okay.
You're back. Okay. So I don't know where I left off,
We
but
were being one of the leaders in this
okay. We were considered on a global stage to be one of the leaders when it came to environmental policy. That's obviously taken a huge turn for the worse in the last few years with the election of our current government. And it genuinely seems like this government only has the interests of big oil companies and the tar sands in mind when they're dealing with Canada's clean energy and climate change policy.
What is the UNFCCC like?
Well, this is tricky. To start with, the UNFCCC is a nightmare of acronyms. So for anyone that comes in here, it's, you could spend months trying to get your head around, I could probably give you the description in pure acronyms, but the UNFCCC is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was a result of a number of negotiations that began in the 80s and went into Rio in 1992. And the Conference of the Parties is a collection of almost all of the countries in the world that have signed on to this convention, and they meet once on a large scale per year at the Conference of the Parties, which is the meeting we're at now. The next, oh God, this is actually kind of hard to explain.
And what do they meet to try to do?
The UN is the only forum that we have where all countries can participate in these discussions, and that's why it's so important. There are over 180 countries that have their voice heard here, and obviously when we're talking about an issue like climate change, this is critical. We can't have, the G20 or the richest countries in the world talking about things that ultimately impact some of the poorest countries in the world and the small island states that often don't have a voice in these big international forums. So the UN and this particular meeting is the space where all of those countries come together, everyone has a voice, and they work in a consensus fashion to decide on international agreements to address climate change.
Wow, okay.
Did that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
Totally. What do you think is the most important thing for the public to know about these issues and what's happening?
I think one of the most important things is climate change is an urgent problem. We're not talking about something that we're going to see in 50 or 100 years. We're talking about something whose impacts are being felt now. Sea levels are rising. Small island states are being affected now. In Canada, we've had the hottest year on record this year, and we've seen erratic weather, floods, snowstorms. Our vast northern regions are being incredibly adversely impacted. You talk to anyone that has built their livelihood and their culture up there, and they are seeing dramatic changes. So this is a problem that we can't, we're not talking about solutions 50 years down the road. We're talking about what needs to happen now, and we're already on the wrong trajectory. We are already locked into a pretty significant degree of warming. So in order to avoid even worse impacts, we need to see emissions peaking, now. By 2015, we have to have global emissions at the highest they've ever been. And this is an ambitious thing to think about, but given the urgency of this problem, we don't really have a choice.
And if business as usual continues, what's the world going to look like?
Well, there are kind of two interesting things to look at here. Business as usual is obviously the worst case scenario. Like, we would be on track for at least a 5-degree warming by 2100. I don't know how to say that date properly, 2100. And that would be devastating. I mean, even less than a 1-degree change would impact, I don't know what percentage of ecosystems and biodiversity and even human livelihoods and life. But if we I don't even want to start thinking about what a 5-degree world would look like. It would change everything.
Now, you've come a long way to be here. What are you here for? What are you fighting for?
I think it's critical that Canadians know what the Canadian government is doing here. This government doesn't represent Canadians when it comes to climate change. It's a minority government. The majority of Canadians, the vast majority of Canadians, want to see strong action on climate change, and they need to know that in every instance their government is not delivering on this. They need to know that their government comes here and not only does nothing, but actually in many ways plays a destructive and blocking role when it comes to the broader international negotiations and preventing the majority of countries in the world from moving ahead with more ambitious climate change policy.
So are you worried about having kids yourself? Are you worried about your future? Are you worried about your family? Like, where does your drive to do this come from?
Wow, that's one of those profound questions that you have to think about. Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, the impacts of climate change are happening now, and we need to keep that in mind. People from small island states, from the most vulnerable regions of the world, are being impacted, and that's a powerful thing. But this is also an intergenerational issue. I don't want to know that there's 500 generally middle-aged white men negotiating in the other building about my future and the future of a family that I may choose to have. That's completely unacceptable. So yeah, I'm here both for the people that are already feeling the impacts, but also for the future generations that have had no part in creating this catastrophic problem, and also unfortunately are not having a big enough voice in the solutions that we're going to need to solve it.
What can the layperson do to be a part of the change?
We all know the day-to-day actions that we can take to be more responsible environmental citizens. We hear them all the time, change your light bulb, take public transport, turn down your heat, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, one of the most critical things that people should be doing now is telling their government that they care about this problem. Sending a message to the Canadian government that, no, by playing this destructive position, you are not representing me. This is an important problem to me, and I want to see action in Canada on climate change now. So, meet with your MP, talk to them, tell them you care. That's their job. They're your elected representative. They have to listen to you as a constituent. So I think that that's one of the most important roles that you could play as a Canadian right now, is just make sure that our government knows that you want action.
If there was one change that could happen here that would have the most resounding impact, what would it be?
I think the key thing, and we're perhaps being a little idealistic here, would be to see countries commit to a second phase of the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is currently the only international treaty we have to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, and it's being threatened by countries like Canada and Japan and Russia. So what we need to see is these countries step back. This agreement has over 180 signatories that want to see something happen. So we need everyone to get on board and sign up for the next phase so that we can keep this momentum going to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions in the immediate future.
How important is this COP, this Mexico? Is it important because of Kyoto? It doesn't seem as important as Copenhagen.
Well, the way that COPs work is it tends to be every 2 years. There's a major one where they're mandated to have a decision. So Copenhagen last year, they had a mandate, thanks to 2 years before from Bali, to make a decision, which was the Copenhagen Accord. So the in-between years are usually referred to as working years. So this is when countries talk about things, they talk about process, they talk about, the way to move forward towards what will be the next major decision-making COP, which will be in Durban, South Africa in 2011.
Last question. It seems a little unfair to me what's happening here. That there's these really rich and powerful countries who have done the greatest amount of damage, and all these developing countries are paying for it in every way. How do we fix that?
Well, one of the key principles of the Convention on Climate Change, the UN Convention on Climate Change, is this concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. And this is exactly what you just said. This idea that we have these huge industrialized nations that are responsible for the vast majority of this problem. And therefore, they need to be part of the vast majority of the solutions to fix this problem. And that's why this forum is so important, because this is the space where you can be in a huge room, and if someone thinks that Canada or the US isn't doing enough, they have a voice to say that.
If there's one thing you want the entire world or the general public to know about this, what would it be?
Canada has been in the past and has a huge opportunity to play a leadership role at these talks. We're becoming increasingly irrelevant because we're not doing anything. If we were leaders, we would be one of the heroes of this process. So we need to let our government know that that's what we want from them. We want them to step up, take ambitious action at home, stop promoting some of the dirtiest oil on the planet, and show international leadership when it comes to protecting our climate and our planet.